So I didn't really know what to expect. These slides are kind of a weird mishmash and probably give you too much insight into the bizarre workings of my brain. So by way of a little bit more background, are there any folks that have degrees in a social science in the audience? Yeah, all 5 of us. That's awesome, guys. High five. Are there any folks who currently or previously have worked for the federal government, including the military services? A few more, okay. These are my people, right? All 15 of us. So I wrote a dissertation on intelligence and irregular warfare. Those words may not mean anything to you. They meant a lot to the Defense Department in the mid-2000s and led to me spending a year in Afghanistan and teaching Marines and then eventually running a data science company that did a lot of work with DARPA, which they invented the internet. Just ask them. They'll be happy to tell you all about it. It's also why, if you follow me on Twitter, my name is Charlie, because I taught Marines. What do you mean? You know, like Charlie from Top Gun? Yes, like Charlie from Top Gun. So that is who I am, and we're going to talk a little bit about data and social science, and as if the previous discussion wasn't a hard enough act to follow, we're going to talk a little bit about organizations as well. And I actually think mission statements and value statements are really interesting places to analyze organizations because people could make them really bland and sometimes they don't, and that is always a choice. So we'll talk a little bit about all of these kinds of things. So the basics. What is data? How do we get it? Where does it come from? I have a weird love of these like minimalist movie posters, which are actually very good data visualizations, but not using actual data, so that's a whole other piece of the brain here. For me, data, right, is a representation of an underlying political or social process. That is probably not how most of you think about data, right? It pleasantly arrives in some form of ones and zeros. If you live in a world of structured data, congratulations. If you live in a world of unstructured data, my condolences. There'll be beer at lunch. We can collect it in all kinds of different ways, right? So in the world of the US government, there is, the Defense Department always talks about how much data it has. It's true, but you've also never seen a collection of more useless data in your life. We can collect data from classified satellites. We can collect data from the National Security Agency. We can collect data through software that runs on the engine of an F-35 that generates its own diagnostics that only Lockheed Martin can read, right? So we can do all of these sorts of things. And each of those kinds of data has its own set of fingerprints, has its own, no, come back, there we are, data generating process. Most interesting to me is like, what are the behaviors and events that we're actually interested in? You know, what are we trying to do here? It's always the first question that I would start a project with. What is it you would say we're trying to do here? It turns out a number of people who can't answer that question is that it's a good place to start. It's not as straightforward as you would think. But this data is a digital representation of behavior, right? And that it arrives in your laptop, on your servers, through your sensors, whatever, in a non-random fashion, right? There was some set of decisions that dictated the exact ones and zeros that you ended up analyzing. So we would, in a social science setup, we actually do a lot of like hand-collected data, right? We curate, we have sort of definitions of things. We want to say, is this a war, is this not a war? And so there's a definition, right? 1,000 battle deaths means we can call this, quote, a war. Just go with this for a second. Well, that means that there's a whole, under what conditions do you get to 1,000 battle deaths, right? There's like a social set of processes by which people kill each other and kill 1,000 of them, and right? So what's happening from 0 to 1,000 such that we actually see that final set of data? If you're talking about sensors, right, or radars, those sensors or radars are tuned to a certain, they can track metal moving at a certain speed, but the metal has to be of a certain size, and that gets a certain refresh rate, right? There's mechanical elements in those processes as well. If you think about, big kind of the digital exhaust a lot of us, talk about today that's coming from social media platforms or this ridiculous watch or any number of other things that we have, right? There are specific decisions, we aren't always aware of them, coded into how you get a ping every so many seconds on the GPS, right? You get this amount of refresh, you get this amount of storage, it's kept locally for this amount of time before it's uploaded to the server. These are all things that start generating that fingerprint, that underlying data generating process. So that's the weird way that I think about data. I'm always trying to link data to the behavior that actually generated it in the world, right? How did it go from an action someplace on the planet to a file on your server or your laptop? Okay, so what is social science, right? I will caveat this by saying that I have a really peculiar vision of what social science is and don't speak for any other social scientist. Please don't tell my advisors any of this. I actually think that social science is fundamentally about reasoning under uncertainty, right? There's stuff we want to know. There's stuff we can actually see. We got to bridge that gap. I don't know why that's doing that exactly, but we'll try to keep track. So sometimes that's about inferences, right? How many folks here have taken statistics at some point? That's good, because there was a second there that didn't look like it was going to be very many. Statistics are about inferences, right, and how you go from a sample to the whole population. Anybody know about Bayes' theorem from statistics, right? Which is sort of a set of observations and we infer back to the unknown piece. Any folks read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow? Danny Kahneman, right? They decided a whole set of ideas which really undergird behavioral economics. But are the cognitive biases, basically all the ways in which we're really bad Bayesian thinkers. We actually don't update properly with Bayesian information, which anybody who's taken statistics and then lived in the world realizes, but it's still an important thing to remind economists and political scientists and a whole bunch of us who have rational models of the world cobbling around in our heads. This last piece, the work from Kahneman and Tversky for folks who actually do decision support or do some really big projects trying to take, all the big data and make it useful for forecasting and other things is really important because it turns out the way that humans process data is not the way that Bayes would want you to. And a lot of the biases that they talk about, whether it's halo effect or recency bias or all of these sorts of things, you could say gum up the works, but it's actually how humans, even engineers, think about the world. And so making those explicit is a really important piece of this. I tend to think that it's really hard to know what humans actually want. I also tend not to care enough about that, probably. You only see what they do, right? And so this is a set of, this sometimes is called revealed preference analysis, but it drives a lot of survey research and other kinds of things. You're trying to understand what a population, what a set of employees, what a set of voters is going to do, but sometimes all we can do is ask them, right? And when they think that there's some sort of link between what they say and what they're going to do. Fundamental in all this, and this is where this previous discussion is pretty interesting, is how do you aggregate individual preferences, individual ideas about what I am going to do to organizational behaviors or organizational outcomes, right? So any one set of individual voters might do something, but what is the group outcome? Sometimes we call this tragedy of the commons or prisoner's dilemmas. These are specific examples of how individual rational decisions get less than ideal outcomes for the group. But there's lots of different research and theories and findings on the ways in which individual preferences and decisions get aggregated to the group. I like to talk about groups and institutions. That's sort of where I'm comfortable. I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so individual preferences are a little challenging for me to get my head around. But a lot of the questions that we ask, both in business and in government, are actually fundamentally social science questions. Survey research, we want to know what's going to happen in an election, whether this marketing campaign is going to work or has worked, what is the influence of a particular set of targeted ads from Russia, all of these kinds of things. Forecasting are fundamentally social science questions, building those models correctly. I build models for, protests and political violence. You might build models for user behavior, right? Those are all ways of looking at what's happening today, something we know about, and trying to project that into the future, right? That thing we haven't yet directly observed. What I call this slide's for Steve. What I call this sometimes is this effort to translate data into behavior. Behavior into data, right? So if there's a set of behaviors in the world that we find interesting, whether that's user behavior, how long are they going to stay on this website, right? If it's voters, or if it's much broader, right? Is this village stable, right? There's a set of, variables or indicators or other measures that we might walk through. So when I spent some time working with Marines in Afghanistan, and one of the things, the big, to borrow a phrase from the previous discussion, or question for a war like that is, are we winning? To which my question is always back, how would you know? It turns out is a really dislocating question for a lot of people, right? They actually have a really hard time figuring out the how would you know piece of that. And so if you kind of, work that down several levels, from generals back down to sergeants and privates, we would talk about, is this village stable? Are things getting, quote, better? And it's sort of, I didn't really like the question. I'm like, if you were out on patrol and this village were stable, what would you see? Ma'am, the kids would be outside playing. Okay. Tell me about that. Well, if it's safe out, parents will let the kids go outside to play. Okay, I could see a little bit of that. What else would you see if you were physically out walking in this village? What would you see? They'd put glass back in the windows. What now? Well, when there's bombs and IEDs and stuff going off, it breaks the glass in all the shop windows, and glass is expensive, so they won't replace it until they think that they aren't going to get blown up again. Okay, so kids playing outside, glass back in some windows, and then sometimes there was a kind of a third or fourth one. We'd get invited to dinner. I'm like, oh man, tell me about that, right? And so I had a friend whose unit actually tracked number of dinner invitations that people in his platoon got as they were out on patrol, because that was, if it was safe for them to be known to be hosting American Marines in their house, that meant that they weren't going to get shot by the Taliban, basically, overnight for having American Marines in their house, right? So these are what I kind of call honest signals, or they reveal they're really hard to fake, right? These are behaviors that are potentially costly, either by money or by lives from locals, that reveal their assessment, their implied assessment of the safety situation. And there's other kind of ones that you can do on this. Moneyball is actually a great example of this process of how you translate behavior into data. The goal of the baseball team is to win a World Series, but first to win games. How do you win games? You score runs. How do you score runs? You get on base. How do you get on base? You get hits. Just true. Turns out there's other ways to get on base. I was really bad at softball when I was a kid, but I had no problem leaning into pitches. And so you got thighs like this, it doesn't matter. So, it smacks the ball into your leg and you off run into first base. It was great. And so when I read Moneyball, I was like, yes, there's many ways to get on base. Hitting is just this sort of, boring one. But that's translating, so the data that you're looking at, right, in a baseball setup isn't necessarily batting average or home runs, right? The better measure, the fuller measure, right, is on base percentage. It was also undervalued, and so there's an arbitrage opportunity and blah, blah, blah. Now we don't do that anymore. But whatever, that's what the book's about. And also Billy Bean's kind of an interesting dude. We do this in the defense world for lots of different problems. But most folks, it turns out it's actually really difficult to come up with the, measurement of how many dinner invitations you got. That is highly context dependent. It's very locally specific. It also is literally collected by hand and not by satellites, which means it can't be done remotely, it can't be done passively, it can't be done persistently, and so it doesn't scale, as they say, which even the Defense Department would like things to scale, generally. But as you're working through that chain, and as I worked with lots of different teams, both deployed and back here in the States, starting with what you can actually observe is a really useful place, because you'll figure out there what actually are you trying to measure, right? And I think a lot of these challenges on this, whether it's social science or just the kind of data science more broadly, they're not actually modeling problems, they're measurement problems, right? We're trying to figure out the real behaviors that matter And then what's the data that actually captures that? And so sometimes we actually start with a giant mound of data, and we don't know what behaviors are captured in this. Does anybody recognize this? Boston, the worst city in the world. It's, fight me. So this is traffic data. Obviously, we kind of know that now. We're conditioned to, that's a revealed road network, right? There's a lot of behavior captured in movement data of various kinds. The Defense Department has lots of ways of capturing movement data, none of which are as good as Google's. Although Google is interested in all the movement, right? All the people, because we want to create this little lovely heat map to tell you, like, to take Route 2. Have good luck with that. The Defense Department and the intelligence community tends to be more interested in, like, a single person, or like a car or a truck, even though they could get a lot of value out of a wider area sort of population assessment like this. But here, if we want to translate the data into the behavior, what do we need to know about the data? I mean, we think we know what this data is, right? Because we think we recognize it from kind of Google Maps traffic type data, and that the red means that, like, you're not moving, and so we assume that there's some sort of congestion. But that's actually not, that story is not necessarily the one that's being told here, right? And so a lot of times when we get data, we're trying to figure out here's what I have, what could I learn from it? Right, and so we're trying to think about, how did that data come to you? We're back to that data generating process of what were the original parameters of collection? How were the filters set? What was left on the cutting room floor? That's a real problem, again, on the defense and intelligence side, where we have what we call our task collection. You're looking for specific things, and everything that's not that specific thing you throw out. Except totally a month later, you want to know the rest of the things. But you didn't know that at the time. We still tend to think of storage as being really expensive, and so we didn't keep it. The year I spent in Afghanistan was late 2009 and into 2010, and we had at that point been there what we thought was forever, which was to say 9 years, and which is a lot fewer than 16. People came in particular, General McChrystal came in that summer before, and expected to find a rich, what he would have described as a mature theater of operations, right, that had all the benefits of having American troops there for the previous 10 years. What he found was that there was nothing for him to work with in terms of intelligence, partially because most of the intelligence assets had been in Iraq, but partially because we had been collecting information from various sources, both technical and human, on bad guys. We'd find bad guys, we'd kill bad guys. We're actually pretty good at that sort of cycle. But none of that information accumulated in any meaningful sense. So we didn't really know, what Helmand Province looked like season over season, year over year. Because nobody continuously collected anything in Helmand Province for more than 2 weeks at a time. We couldn't map out the Pesh Valley, which goes into Pakistan, which we had lots of foreign fighters coming across, because there was no persistent passive surveillance that just gave us an idea of what things looked like there day to day, week over week. We had information on specific bad guys, and that was it. And so they were really shocked when they showed up to find that we had no real strategic assessment of the entire country. We had spent plenty of money and plenty of time in which that could have been developed, but that's not the way the organizational processes work. We're going to talk about organizations here in just a second. So this sort of activity is one of the places where you need, I think, social scientists, local experts, subject matter experts, who can help brainstorm. This is actually a very creative enterprise to figure out, when you have a giant pile of data, what interesting behaviors might be within that. Both that might be interesting about your users, things that you didn't know about them, things they were doing with the platform or the product that you weren't expecting, things that malicious intent, actors that are not nearly as nice and kind and giving as all of us here in this room, but are trying to subvert the platform or use it for much more nefarious purposes. You need a certain amount of creativity to interrogate that data, to come up with the ideas. What are the patterns of human activity that could generate this string of ones and zeros? Have we actually, is there a weird pattern in the error messages? Are the errors actually capturing something meaningful that we weren't expecting? That's the kind of like exploratory data science work that is pretty exciting. But it's definitely not guaranteed to result in like new product lines or new sales or a lot more money for a company. But is a place where a very broad team that's creative can make some real impact. So what does things look like in terms of data in the real world? I call this the anthropology of data, even though I'm definitely not an anthropologist. But it's sort of a way of thinking about, organizations as an entity that can be analyzed, actually work with data differently, right? So they generate and consume data in different sorts of ways. Think about, Walmart, the U.S. Army, and the Boston Red Sox, right? Those are three organizations that all think of themselves as data-driven, but they're just consuming really different kinds of data for really different purposes, and they generate data in a lot of different ways. We talked earlier about organizational culture, and in particular values-type statements. There are lots of different ways that we can see what an organizational culture here looks like, and we can think about how what it values and prioritizes and how decisions are made. There's a book by Scott Gartner about sort of dominant indicators in war assessments. Again, it's coming back to this idea of, are we winning? And a lot of his analysis focused on this very basic concept of you manage what you measure. You guys ever heard that before? Is that a thing that people still say? What that means is that anybody watching the Vietnam documentary on PBS right now, right? More y'all should watch that if they ever unlock it, because PBS streaming is a very strange place. So if we could solve that problem, then we can all watch the Vietnam documentary, and then we can solve the body count problem, which is that if your measurement of progress, your measurement of success, is how many dead bodies you have, you know what people will do? They will create dead bodies, and they will lie about dead bodies. It turns out that's not a great way of measuring success, especially in a counterinsurgency campaign. One of the things that was used, you might say, well, what else would you use? For example, in the South, some of the Marine units that were there looked at rice production. Again, really local sort of thing. Now you probably could do that with like remote sensing with some sort of LiDAR or some other stuff, but rice, as it turns out, is a very labor-intensive crop. So if people were home tending to rice paddies, that meant they were probably not out with the Viet Cong bombing Saigon or attacking American and other Vietnamese troops. Rice production meant that their lives had sort of returned to a stable, normal day-to-day process. There's a lot of other examples in Gartner. There's lots of other ways that we can look at organizational culture and think about organizations, right? Mission statements, as we said this morning, structure and budgets, hiring, promotion profiles, typical work products. Are you an organization that reads reports and write new ones? Or do you make software? Right? Those are, when you kind of work between the worlds, you start trying to think about, what kind of organization, is this? And I think actually R&D, where do people spend internal research and development dollars? Where do they spend internal investments? These are the things that sort of shape how an organization collects, consumes, and shares data. So, on the government side, what does data mean at the State Department? That's what data looks like at the State Department. There's a really good reason why Hillary Clinton had her own email server, as it turns out. State is like old school. They read reports and they write new ones and everything. They still call them cables, and they send them sometimes on classified systems and sometimes not. And it is an information-driven activity, but that information is done through person-to-person contacts and networks, exquisitely written up, then leaked to WikiLeaks, and then posted online for all of you to read, but not for me to read because I have a clearance. So that is what data looks like at the State Department, and is a function of the work it does and who they think they are, right? The work they think they're supposed to be doing. What does data mean at CIA? This one's kind of unfair because it really should be DIA, but nobody knows what that is. So, stolen weapons plans, right? There's some super squirrely shit that some other country has, and we want it. So we're going to find any number of means, whether human or technical or otherwise, to find it. They think their job is to steal secrets. because that in fact is their job, and they have a number of means of doing that. I should caveat that CIA actually does a lot of really interesting data work, and anybody who wants to talk about any of that, we can do that at a sidebar with a lot more beer. What does data mean at NSA? That always gets a laugh. That's the place where they actually have data and they do stuff with it, and we can decide whether we like what they've collected and what they do with that data. But a fundamentally different culture, both around what data is, but also what they should do with it, right? Really different from other governmental agencies, and I think also, as we're seeing, maybe also from some of the American public. And so that is, one of the, as we think about the data that is being consumed in these organizations, you actually have to understand the organization on its own terms. And there's a lot of variance in the defense and intelligence communities on that front. So that's the world that I live in. You can't really see this very well, but it's a really cool Hunt for Red October poster, which is this weird sort of national security space where on the one hand we have lots of pressure to engage with Silicon Valley because there's some freaking unicorn that's going to solve our data problems if we only can get them under contract or something. But also a set of really core challenges in that the way that we have traditionally done business in the government world doesn't necessarily work as well anymore, right? I mean, I joke about DARPA inventing the internet. They basically did. TCP/IP is a protocol designed for nuclear survivability. They were trying to figure out how they could actually transfer information after a nuclear war for government continuation. They don't usually tell that part of the story. The GPS that's in all of our phones was obviously a government system that was developed for communication and command and control of a whole bunch of different military assets that was then made open. Similar to the way that the NSF opened, the internet for commercial and not just government and academic use. The government doesn't have that advantage in the same way anymore. There's way more innovation happening in the private sector, not just in Silicon Valley, of course, but in a variety of different places. But it's not necessarily focused on social and political challenges in the way that the government is trying to address them. And in fact, maybe creating a bunch of social and political challenges the government then has to investigate through a whole bunch of Senate hearings. These are some of the challenges. I don't really have a great way to end this part of the talk, other than to say a lot of how we've set up the organizational incentives and the organizational culture within the national security community is focused on secrets. There's critical information that other people in the world have, and we want to find ways to get it. We have different kind of methods of pursuing that. I think one of the challenges in the 21st century is that we're actually confronted with a lot of mysteries. The world is changing at a very rapid pace. There's a lot of emergent behavior, whether in protests that become revolutions or technologies that eat the world. And there's no person that you can spy on to find the answer to that question, right? There's no mail that you can read or computer that you can hack that has the answer. Instead, you need a much broader set of techniques, a much wider pool of talent that's going to help you unpack the mysteries of that and get a broader set of kind of contingent answers. And we need policies and other sorts of things that go along with that. So that is a little view into my world. By all means, listen to the podcast, Bombshell, for more on the rocks, and we'll talk more over beer. So thanks.